Henry from Fort Gratiot, Michigan. Democrats line. Hello. Henry from Michigan, are you there?
Thank you, Colonel, for your service. And I would just like to say that while I'm glad our troops are coming home from Afghanistan, I do say this with great trepidation, because I've listened all morning to a lot of paranoid callers who talk about posse comitatus, who talk about how President Obama has ruined the country, when in fact these paranoid, delusional people who voted for George W. Bush twice, George W. Bush ruined this country. But my concern is that you're going to bring all these troops home to what? You're going to bring them home to a divided country, to be influenced by paranoid people like the woman from Kentucky who calls President Obama a Muslim, Wayne LaPierre, who says that black and brown people are going to loot and riot, so everybody needs guns.
So your question or comment on Afghanistan's for our guest, so he can respond to it, sir?
Sure, I'm getting to that. When we get these people home, and they don't have jobs because Congress is blocking jobs, and they have PTSD, and they have all these problems that we have in this country right now, I'm wondering, should these people have access to 30-round clip weapons, assault weapons?
Okay, caller, thanks.
Well, I think, Henry, thank you for your call and thank you for your comments. The basic idea is that, of course, you were touching on issues like gun control and many other different things. And the question really is, can our people come back from Afghanistan and have gainful employment when they come back? And the answer has to be, the nation has to do it in such a way that the answer must be yes. Now, it's going to be a long time, and the reality of the situation is that, unfortunately, for many veterans right now, their unemployment rate is much higher than it should be, and much higher than in comparison to their civilian peers. So this is really a wake-up call for employers everywhere to take a look and see what they can do to help the veterans that have so valiantly fought for our country in places like Afghanistan and Iraq achieve their personal goals, whether it is staying in the service and serving longer, or coming out and entering the civilian workforce. So that becomes a major social question for our country, for Congress, for the President to answer, and to do it in a way that is just and credible for the veterans and their service.
James Parker says that I don't believe Afghanistan will change after the U.S. military leaves. They'll revert back to their old ways, just as when Russia left. To that last part, are there comparisons to be made with what happened when the Russians left Afghanistan and then what we're doing now currently?
Yes, there are, and very unfortunately, because when we first went into Afghanistan, it was very clear that there was a significant difference between the way American forces conducted themselves in Afghanistan and the way the Russians did. And James brings up some very interesting points, because the biggest comparison is in essence related to the length of time that both the Russian forces, or the Soviet forces at the time, and the American forces have stayed in Afghanistan. It's pretty similar. The difference is in the way in which the forces have conducted themselves. Yes, there have been isolated incidents with American forces doing some very bad things in Afghanistan, but generally speaking, they have been dealt with, and they've been dealt with very quickly. In the case of the Russians, that was not the case. It was common practice to conduct atrocities. It was common practice to do things against the Afghan population, in essence decimate the Afghan population that opposed the Russian presence there and opposed the central government that the Russians supported. So what you're dealing with there is a situation where the big analogy is the length of time, and the fact that the Afghans don't like a foreign occupier, no matter what kind of foreign occupier it is. And I'm afraid that he's right. The Afghans will probably revert back to the type of society that they had before 2001 and before we entered the country.
Here's Tom from Dayton, Ohio, independent line.
Hi, this is Tom.
Hi, Tom.
I appreciate your service, Colonel Leighton, and I just wanted to tell you, or ask the question, do you believe that it's good policy to go into a country where they have such a different culture and a different government, and then try to install a new government where the cultures are so completely different, and then try to make those the populace of that country change over to a new, like a democracy. Do you think that's valid foreign policy?
It depends on where you go. I think when you look, Tom, at the way in which we handled Europe after the Second World War and Japan after the Second World War, I think by and large those experiments were very successful. You know, the Marshall Plan, especially in Europe, that raised the level of economic well-being for all of that portion of the continent. And that was a big deal, and it worked culturally. In Afghanistan and countries like it, there are going to be significant differences culturally, significant differences in terms of educational preparedness, societal preparedness to handle this type of institutions that we like. You know, to put Jeffersonian democracy and give it an imprint that works for a place like Afghanistan is a very, very difficult thing to do. And I think that we have found that it is practically impossible to do it on a nationwide basis. There are Afghan institutions that work on a somewhat democratic basis, but then there are aspects of Afghan society and culture that don't quite fit with our worldview. And so it becomes very difficult for us to impose our way of working, our way of doing things on a culture that is thousands of years old. And I believe that this forces us to recognize that and to say, if you go in to a country and do the things that we needed to do after 9/11/2001, you have to go in with a plan, and you have to realize that you won't change a culture that has been there for so long. But what you have to do is you have to go in, take care of business in the sense of, from a military standpoint, eliminate the threat to you, and then provide institutions that will allow that government to do what it needs to do in order to survive in a way that at least is not an enemy of us, is not antithetical to U.S. interests. So it's a very, very difficult exercise. And you know, if anything, Afghanistan has been a great laboratory for us to learn and to understand how this works. Unfortunately, they are not able, in my opinion, to take the imprint that we have given them and move it forward in a way that we would be completely satisfied with. There may be aspects that they can do, and in some respects they're working hard at that in certain areas, but in other areas they are in essence reverting back to the rule of the Taliban, and that's a very dangerous proposition.
The outgoing Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, talked about the Afghans' role post-U.S. operations, and he talked about how the Afghanis were on track when it came to being able to take over in 2014. I want to show you a little bit of what he had to say, get your response to it.
Sure.
The United States, NATO, and the Afghan government agreed in Lisbon in 2010 and affirmed in Chicago last year that Afghanistan will assume full responsibility for its security by the end of 2014. We are well on track for that goal, and we will maintain a long-term commitment to Afghanistan, including through the continued training and equipment of Afghan forces in counterterrorism operations against al-Qaeda and their affiliates.
Your thoughts on his perspective?
Well, you know, from the effort that has been put into it, I can't blame him for saying what he said. Secretary Panetta has done a great job in being a steward of the Pentagon. The fact of the matter is, when you look at Afghanistan and the readiness of the culture to actually move things forward in a way that is commensurate with U.S. interests, we're not there yet. We even have difficulties with the current government of Hamid Karzai in Kabul. And because we have those difficulties, because his interests are not congruent with our interests, it's a stretch to say that they are going to take over and do things in a way that will be completely parallel to our interests. So having said that, then you look at the tactical aspect, the actual way in which each of the Afghan elements, military elements, has trained. Each of the Afghan elements is really taking to the field after that training. And what you find is that significant portions of the Afghan military actually have real problems fielding all of their forces. They are, in some ways, you can make an analogy between their forces and what happened to the U.S. Continental Forces in the American Revolution, in the sense that they were seasonal soldiers. And, you know, if it was crop time, you know, planting time or harvesting time, a lot of those soldiers disappeared to take care of those duties. In the Afghan situation, it's very similar. In many cases, there's a high absentee rate. It was much worse, in a few years ago. But you have the high absentee rate. You have a very high rate of illiteracy, with basically 28.1% of the population being literate. Huge challenge in terms of training and being able to employ sophisticated weapon systems, and also work the command and control structure that is necessary to really conduct modern warfare. That's the kind of thing that you're dealing with. So I would beg to differ a bit with Secretary Panetta and say that they're not completely ready. Elements are ready, but to say that they are on track and will be the primary force that is going to take Afghanistan forward in a security sense after 2014, I think is a bit premature.
What then factor in what happens to Afghanistan security-wise when Hamid Karzai isn't president anymore?
There are two basic policies, situations that could happen. One of which is that Afghanistan descends into a series of warlord-run entities, warlord-run districts. And these warlord-run districts would be very similar to what happened in the period just before 9/11, where you had the Northern Alliance, and you had Pashtun elements, and you had other elements basically fighting for control of various parts of Afghanistan against the central government in Kabul, the Taliban government. Then you have a situation where that split could be accentuated once the Americans leave. The other part of this is that the Taliban could take over completely. Now, I think they would face resistance, especially by the forces that made up the Northern Alliance in the past. That's the northern area, and also the ethnic minorities, the Tajiks and others. And because of those differences, I unfortunately foresee a lot of conflict within Afghanistan. Once NATO and the American forces leave the country, there will be even more conflict, more sectarian strife, more violence between the various elements, and I find it would be very hard to believe that the central government, as it's currently configured in Kabul, could pull all of that together and create a somewhat peaceful state as existed before, let's say, 1975 or so.
Don't forget that if you've served in Afghanistan and you want to weigh in on this topic from your perspective, 202-585-3883 is the number that you can call and talk to our guest. Ron from Jacksonville, Florida, up next. He's on our Republican line. Hi.
Good morning. I served in Vietnam, but we didn't accomplish nothing there. We left all our equipment there for North Vietnamese to use. We didn't destroy it, other than the helicopters that they got on. But that's not the point. The point is that we shouldn't be in Afghanistan to start with. Let's take our security. Let's talk about Grenada. That was our college students over there when we had the conflict over there with Castro and his army. Okay, another thing is, let's pull them all out, because there's going to be wars there for thousands and thousands of years, and just protect our interest in the United States. We know where the Al-Qaeda and all them operate and where they operate out of. Let's make sure that they get frisked or really searched before they can even come into the United States.
Right, Ron, thank you so much. When you look at what happens in the world and our involvements, your service in Vietnam, there were a lot of different things that were mismanaged in Vietnam, and that is one of the things that we used in order to change the way the armed forces are structured today. A lot of changes were the result of the problems that we experienced in Vietnam, and a lot of the changes that are not visible to the public are the result of what happened in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But when you look at the Afghan situation, it does make sense to be able to have a strike force that can go in and take care of problems that come from a particular country. In the case of 9/11, obviously, as you know, we had a situation where the Taliban supported Al-Qaeda, was host to Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda used that as a base to mount the attacks against the United States. And it wasn't a base in the way that we understand that, but it was still a place, a safe haven for them to go and for them to plan and for them to get ready for the attacks on September the 11th. And you need to have a capability that eliminates those kinds of threats. In some cases, you need to have the ability to put boots on the ground and be able to understand from a direct impression what is going on in particular countries around the world. Doesn't mean invading them, but it does mean working with them. And it depends on the situation. Sometimes you have to go in and you have to take care of threats to you. But you also have to understand, as a country, we have to understand when you have to withdraw, and it becomes very, very important to withdraw at the right moment and not, in essence, overstay your welcome or overstay the tactical and strategic usefulness of your presence in a particular place. Now, if we had had the strategic foresight to look at both Afghanistan and Iraq as counterweights to Iran, that story might be a little bit different. But we have not really used that strategic leverage and that strategic foresight to go in and make an argument to kind of balance off the Iranian influence in both those countries. And I'm afraid that's going to be another issue that we'll have to contend with. So I don't see us withdrawing too much from our foreign engagements, and we have to be very careful that we understand the areas that we go into in order to really affect the change that we need there.